The box was found in the spring of 1910, deep beneath a rotted floorboard of a ruined plantation house near the Sabine River. When the men pried it open, their picks and shovels scraping the rusted iron hinges, the stench that escaped was ancient, like the exhale of a buried fever. Inside lay a smaller box, tar-sealed, and in it, what looked like human teeth, arranged in neat rows, each one carved faintly with a single letter. Beneath the teeth was a strip of parchment that had not yellowed but blackened, as though it had burned without fire. On it, barely legible, scrawled in the unsteady hand of someone very near madness, were the words, "He never belonged to any man. He only waited." The sheriff packed the evidence in cotton and sent it to Dallas, where a curious deputy clerk, bored and skeptical, began to trace the initials carved into the teeth. By the end of his second week, he had matched 3 sets of initials to men once registered as slaveholders, all of them having died violently between 1848 and 1853, all within 70 miles of each other, and all owning for a time the same enslaved man. The last purchaser's name was Judge Willard Green, a figure revered in early Texas law and politics, a man whose descendants still sat in marble offices when that box was found. But Green's purchase, like those before him, ended in what newspapers of the time called the strangest rash of deaths ever recorded in the Republic's short history. Tonight we reopen that box. We follow the blood-stained trail of the man the frontier came to whisper about as the deadliest slave in Texas. His name was Sambo, or Samuel. Records differ, but his story would twist through the swamps and oak groves of antebellum Texas like a haunting that refused to be exorcised. Before we continue with the story of Samuel, the man who eliminated every master who bought him, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The tale begins not in blood, but in land. Wild, wide, and brutal. Texas in the 1840s was a raw wound of a place. It was the decade after its revolution against Mexico, before it was annexed by the United States. The air smelled of mesquite smoke and horse sweat. Flags changed faster than crops could root. Every man carried a pistol, and every church sermon sounded like an argument with God. East Texas, where the story's shadows lengthen, was a landscape of contradictions. To the west stretched dusty cattle trails. To the east, the thick pine woods and muddy creeks, where plantation labor clawed a living from the soil. Slavery there wore a different face than in the old states of the Deep South. It was rougher, less polished, more lawless. Some masters were newly arrived adventurers chasing quick fortune, others ex-Confederates already dreaming of hierarchies to come. At dawn you could hear hammers on wooden porches, the hiss of iron in blacksmith forges, the distant moan of a field hymn carried through smoke. At night, coyotes serenaded the edge of the cotton rows, where enslaved families huddled in cabins patched with moss, tin, and prayer. The Republic's fragile government issued proclamations about order, faith, and citizenship, but in truth, power lay with whoever owned the most men with the least conscience. Into this world, around 1827 by most reckonings, Samuel was born. Not in Texas, but somewhere in coastal Georgia. Shipping manifests list an enslaved infant by that name sold from Savannah to New Orleans in 1831, then again in 1834 to a planter named Oswin Harlow along the Trinity River. Harlow named the boy Sammy. Plantation records describe him in brief, statistical phrases. Strong shoulders, uncommon calm, eyes dark gray. There was an odd notation beside his age. No fear of flame. Most of the Harlow estate burned in the summer of 1842. Witnesses said lightning struck the cotton house. Others swore they heard screaming before the fire took it. Harlow's death was attributed to smoke inhalation. He was found upright, sitting in his chair, charred but not fallen. The inventory after his funeral shows that one enslaved man was unaccounted for: Sammy. 5 years later, a new registry appeared in Liberty County, the purchase of a Negro man named Sambo by a preacher and cotton broker named Ezekiel Murdoch. The handwriting on the bill of sale is tight, legalistic, but scrawled beneath it in red ink, perhaps a county clerk's jest, perhaps a warning, are the faint words, "Lord, help the next one." Murdoch's chapel still stands in skeleton form, near a modern highway now. In its day, it was a revival tent turned permanent tabernacle, a place where men came to confess and left trembling, eager to buy new acres and new souls. In those fiery sermons, one could catch the conflicting pieties of frontier faith, salvation for some, binding chains for others. The frontier could make monsters even of men who sang hymns. Across the region, the social order rested on suspicion and weaponry. A woman walking alone was asked whose property she belonged to. A freedman's paper was scrutinized more closely than a land deed. Yet for all the talk of obedience and faith, whispers spread in quarters and taverns about strange reckonings, fires that started without spark, masters found twisted in bed with no mark of assault. By 1850, Texas had entered the Union, swelling with ambition and dread. Cotton fetched high prices in New Orleans. The railroads hadn't yet tamed the plains, but telegraph lines buzzed like veins along the Gulf Coast. Preachers warned that God's punishment for the sin of slavery would fall not as thunder, but as a creeping terror in the night. They did not know how literally those words would prove. Out of those pine woods and contested borders would emerge a mosaic of rumor, of an enslaved man passed from owner to owner, each dying and humble businessman. In truth, he was a knot of contradictions, half preacher, half speculator, a man equally fluent in scripture and deceit. His sermons could draw a crowd of farmers for miles. His auctions drew even more. He lived on a hill he named Mount Galilee, its whitewashed chapel squatting beside his 2-story home. Both structures leaned slightly, as if the ground beneath them resented their presence. Ezekiel's right hand trembled badly from an old wound sustained during the War for Texas independence. He would clamp it behind his back when addressing his congregation, lending him the air of a prophet delivering judgment. "He listens well," Murdoch wrote in his ledger after buying Samuel. "Strong, never speaks unless asked, keeps his eyes down, might do better than the stubborn lot we had before." But his wife, Lydia Murdoch, sent something else. She recalled in a letter to her sister, preserved only in fragments, how the man moved too quietly, like he knows where every board will groan before it does. Lydia's tone was not that of pity, but unease. One evening she overheard her husband and their overseer, Tom Greaves, debating what to do with the new field hand. "He's quick," Greaves said. "Obeys soon as you speak." But he hesitated, and Ezekiel leaned forward across the table, lantern light throwing stripes across his face. "But what? Never seen him pray. Won't sing with the others neither. When the bell rings for service, he'll stand out yonder just watching." Ezekiel's lips drew tight. "Then I'll bring the Spirit to him myself." That week, he conducted a forced baptism in the cold spring by the creek. Samuel stood waist-deep in the water while Ezekiel thundered passages from Leviticus. Witnesses said the moment the preacher pressed him under, thunder cracked without a cloud in sight. The old man slipped. His lame hand scraped the rocks, and for a second, everyone thought he drowned too. But when Ezekiel surfaced, sputtering, Samuel simply watched him, neither frightened nor relieved. That look, some claimed later, haunted Murdoch through every sermon that followed. South along the Trinity River lived Judge Willard Green, tall, proud, and born as if the law itself were his birthright. He'd come from North Carolina with wagon-loads of books, plantation equipment, and a throat always a bit sore from courtroom oratory. Green's empire was not built on brute labor but on paper, deeds, contracts, and credit agreements that stretched like chains across several counties. People called him the man who writes decisions in God's own ink. He wore broadcloth coats even in summer and carried a silver powder flask in his waistcoat. His only child, Eliza, was 16 when Samuel finally came into her father's control. She later described, in a letter found among family papers decades later, the day they first brought the man into the yard. He looked not afraid, even with the irons loose at his wrists. Father said he'd come from Murdoch's lot, sold cheap after trouble in the fields, though I think they sold him quick because no overseer would stay near him. Eliza's handwriting wavered at the next lines. Something in his eyes. I cannot tell if gentle or hollow. Somehow both. When Father spoke, he stared straight through him, as though Father were the one chained. Judge Green prided himself on discipline as well as benevolence. He ruled his estate like a courtroom, organized by bells, punishments, and reason. That was the word he loved best. He would quote Cicero at breakfast, then order 20 lashes before lunch. At dinner one night, Eliza asked, "Do you ever think they hate us, Papa?" He dabbed his lips carefully with a white napkin. Hate is a privilege, my dear. The enslaved feel hunger, not philosophy. But Samuel, he listens when you speak, like he understands every word. Let him understand, Green said, smiling thinly. Understanding makes obedience. There are photographs of the Green estate taken in later years after emancipation. Oak trees draped with moss, a cracked sundial, the ruins of slave quarters sinking into wild grass. In the glass plates of those images, on the steps of the main house, a faint shadow appears beside the judge's chair, unformed, tall, almost motionless. Some archivists say it's just a trick of exposure. Others swear it's a figure that doesn't quite fit the time of day. Historians also preserve the testimony of a woman named Clara Bell, a freedwoman interviewed by the WPA in the 1930s. She claimed to have been a child on Judge Green's property during those years. Her recollection offers the most direct glimpse of Samuel's demeanor. Mr. Sam, we call him. Never holler, never whip nobody. One time I cut my foot right bad with the hoe. He just tore his own shirt to bind it. But the other folks, they never keep eye on him long. Say he talked to himself in the night like praying. But wrong way. Words go backwards. When asked what she meant, Clara hesitated, then said softly, "Seem like he talking to the ground, asking it to remember." The interviewer pressed her for more. She answered only, "Every morning sun come up, there the judge go, looking old as wood. Every night Mr. Sam looks same as yesterday. Not tired, not changed, same eyes." Away in between Murdoch's betrayal and Green's fatal purchase, there were the lost owners, names half faded in county records. A man named Josiah Rope, found hanging in his barn with a noose of twisted horsehair. A widow, Margaret Blynn, dead beside a shattered mirror said to show her reflection moving after she had already fallen. Each name appears in local ledgers beside the inked mark of transfer. Property known as Sam. Sale complete. Collecting these fragments today feels like piecing together a crime scene preserved only in whispers. No photograph exists of Samuel, though an 1851 newspaper caricature from Galveston depicts a rebellious savage standing over a corpse, body surrounded by strange glyphs, clearly a racist fantasy, yet eerie in its uncanny accuracy. The only description universally repeated is that he bore a shallow burn mark on his left shoulder, shaped like a hand. No one could tell if it was scarring or something older, something given rather than earned. There was one more figure entwined in all this. Father Auguste Delarue, a French Catholic missionary stationed near Liberty. In letters preserved by his order, He wrote about his encounters with both Ezekiel Murdoch and Judge Green, chastising them for their brutality. But among the folded pages, a note remains that diverges sharply from theology. I have spoken to the Negro called Samuel. He is not unlearned. When I questioned him in my poor Creole tongue, he replied with patience and in an accent I cannot place. Once I asked where he learned to read the small Latin verses I carried. He told me he had never seen such marks before, but that the shapes make a sound in my head. The priest continued, "There is an intelligence there that terrifies me. When I gave him the sign of the cross, he smiled, not in blasphemy, but pity." Rumor later had it that Father Delarue went missing sometime after visiting the Green estate in the winter of 1852. The diocese records simply say he departed for missions further west. The archives of any such mission contain no trace of him. Through these portraits, the preacher, the judge, the daughter, the freedwoman, the priest, we glimpsed the lattice of lives around Samuel. Each saw a different shape when they looked at him. Servant, stranger, sinner, spirit. Each believed they held power over him until their lives intersected with an outcome none could escape. When the community later whispered about those deaths, they called it a chain of misfortune. But misfortune requires chance. What happened next would feel deliberate, almost mathematical, as though a quiet vow was being fulfilled, one household at a time. The first signs would come in small touches, a door that wouldn't stay latched, tools glinting with residue from night fires, and echoes of footsteps long after everyone slept. In the preacher's ruined chapel, and then again on the grand estate of Judge Green, these murmurs multiplied, until no one could tell if they dreamt them or lived them. It began with the animals. On Murdoch's property, hogs stopped rooting near the north end of the fields. They'd snort, recoil, and run squealing toward the pens as if driven by invisible hands. Later, men said the soil there was darker, slicker, as though something beneath had bled upward. At first, Ezekiel cursed the overseer's laziness, commanding Samuel to dig until the rot was gone. But when the hole widened, releasing an odor sour and metallic, the preacher turned pale and ordered it filled before sundown. That night, Samuel did not sleep in his cabin. He lay outside beside the creek until dawn, eyes open, watching the stars as if waiting for a sign. One of the field hands, a boy named Reuben, crept close enough to hear him whispering, not prayers but names. Names the boy did not recognize, except one, Murdoch. 2 weeks later, Mount Galilee Chapel burned. Witnesses saw a strange green flame licking the steeple, so bright that some swore it must have been phosphorus, though no such chemical could be found. Ezekiel escaped alive, his hands scorched and trembling more violently than ever. In the panic, Samuel vanished, leaving behind only the bare imprint of feet leading toward the swampland. A year afterward, Ezekiel Murdoch was dead. Supposedly apoplexy, though the body was found stiff in bed, eyes bulged wide open, no other sign of struggle. His wife Lydia screamed when she saw the mark on his chest. The shape of a handprint burned into flesh, identical to the scar Samuel once bore on his shoulder. Locals whispered that Ezekiel had baptized something that had baptized him back. By 1851, rumors of the man's reappearance reached the courthouse squares of Liberty and Polk counties. Trackers claimed to see a lone figure walking barefoot through fog, carrying an old brass medallion shaped like a cross. He was said to exchange work for food, rarely speaking, yet leaving behind uncanny calm, as though the air itself stayed listening after he'd gone. Judge Green's overseer, Tom Greaves, the same man who'd worked for Murdoch, found him near a creek one dusky evening. Samuel was sitting on a fallen log, whittling the stem of a tobacco pipe into a spiral. Greaves raised his lantern. "You Murdoch's boy?" "No one's," came the reply, quiet even polite. Greaves smirked. "No one's till they hang you for running." Samuel glanced toward the darkening trees. "Then you best start building the gallows tonight." Something in that calm voice chilled the overseer's liquor-softened nerves. But greed and pride overcame superstition. Greaves captured him, brought him to Green's estate, and sold him for a sheriff's bounty plus reward for runaway property. When Judge Green questioned why this nameless slave fetched so low a price, Greaves shrugged. "Folks spooked, sir. Say's bad luck. Say every master he had's dead." The judge laughed, dismissing it as backwoods gossip. "Bad luck doesn't exist in a court of law?" "Maybe not, sir," Greaves whispered. "But the law don't sleep in them woods neither." Not even a month passed before small, inexplicable misfortunes crept into the Green household. The judge's prized stallion, Ajax, bolted in the dead of night and broke its neck on the oak fence. Cellar jars of preserved fruit turned rancid overnight. Bricks crumbled to powder at a touch. Eliza began waking from dreams of drowning in shallow water. She would bolt upright, her hair damp, sheets chilled as though someone had spilled river water across them. One late evening she found Samuel standing outside the big house, staring at the horizon. His clothes were neat, his body unmoving. "Why do you stand there so still?" she asked from the porch. He looked up slightly, waiting. For what? For the land to finish remembering. His tone was unthreatening, yet she stepped back. In the lamplight, his shadow did not quite align with his body. It leaned a fraction left, like it belonged to someone else. That week, the house cook reported every clock stopping at the same instant, 12 minutes after midnight, each night for 3 days. On the 4th, one clock burst its glass face, shards landing in the shape of a small cross. Judge Green laughed once more, explaining it away as humidity. This country plays tricks on English clocks, but when he tried to wind the broken one, the key snapped clean in two, and the smell of singed wood filled the room without visible fire. Father Delarue, then traveling circuit through the region, came by invitation to bless the Green household. He arrived with a small box of relics and a single candle said to have been lit originally in a cathedral near Lyon. The judge received him cordially but with faint disdain. "I respect your missions, Father," Green began. "But my house fears no superstition. You'll excuse the pageantry, of course." Delarue smiled. "Faith is not superstition, Judge, and pageantry sometimes protects even unbelievers." As they spoke, Eliza poured wine into 2 goblets. Samuel entered silently with a tray of bread. The priest noted the scar on his shoulder, blinked twice, and set down the cup. "Tell me, son," said the priest, his accent soft. "Have you knowledge of Christ?" Samuel's voice held neither reverence nor insult. "He keeps to his own vengeance. I keep to mine." The judge's laughter choked into silence, perhaps sensing the words carried no jest. Night fell heavy that evening, thunderless yet full of pressure, as if the sky waited to hear rather than to speak. While the family dined, a strange smell rose from the cellar, metallic and sharp, like coins heated on coals. The servants investigating found every wine bottle shattered, liquid pooling in perfect circles on the stone floor. No wind, no rats, just the faint echo of humming. Father Delarue blessed the house in haste before dawn and departed on horseback. He was never reliably seen again. His mare returned 3 days later, riderless, saddle crusted with salt stains that did not smell of sweat, but of seawater. After that, the judge forbade anyone to speak of spirits. Yet fear lodges itself like dust. It can't be expelled, only rearranged. Workers drifted away to neighboring farms. Those who stayed reported hearing a second voice in the fields when Samuel worked alone, a whisper repeating his motions. Hoe, turn, lift, cover. In winter, the judge found footprints circling his study, bare feet pressed into the dust though the door had stayed locked. A legal brief he'd been drafting lay open to the margin where something, had written in smudged ash, "Every bargain holds 2 signatures." He burned the paper immediately. The morning after, on the east fence line, a traveler found Tom Greaves lying with his neck at an angle no living man could hold. No prints but his own led there. By then, the townspeople ceased saying Samuel's name aloud. They called him that one. Mothers warned children, "Don't stare in wells, you might see him looking back." On humid nights, dogs barked toward the cypress swamp and did not stop till dawn. Eliza recorded one final entry in her diary before discontinuing it altogether. Pa grows thinner. I think he forgets to eat. He stares at the horizon same as Samuel once did. Once, in the mirror, I thought I saw 2 of him, one looking on, patient, as the other wrote at his desk. I blinked, and it was gone. The windows have turned dark windward, no matter the hour. Neighbors described the Greens as troubled by illness, though none called a doctor. The family refused visitors. Rumors spread that the judge had taken to quoting scripture backward. By the time anyone dared check on the household, months later, the grand estate's shutters were drawn, iron gates strangled by vines. The small traces of dread that began as broken clocks and whispers were swelling into something worse, a corrosion of light, sanity, and reason. Something old, slow, and justice-minded stalked beneath the mask of happenstance. Soon the killings would no longer be rumor but documented fact. Early spring of 1853, the year when the nights seemed longer than the days, and even the sky over Liberty County hung low, dimming faster than it ought. The land itself appeared to sag under some invisible weight. At first, the sheriff dismissed the pattern of deaths as coincidence, a bad season mixed with worse tempers. But patterns have a way of whispering to the observant, and it wasn't long before even the hardest skeptic leaned forward in the tavern corners when someone spoke the name Green. A young reporter, Levi Pritchard, rode from Galveston to investigate the rumors of field curses and vengeful slaves. His editor believed only in copy that sold papers, not in demons. Still, Levi arrived carrying both ink and unease. He wrote in his notebook, preserved still in the state archives, "There is a sickness here not of body, but of conscience, and the air itself recoils from the truth. They say Judge Green keeps to his home, that the Negro works his crops alone, and that the nights bring singing without mouth or breath." One afternoon, Levi visited the Green estate unannounced. The once grand property looked withered fences ecchymosed with mold, brass knockers tarnished to a sickly color. When Samuel opened the door, Levi described the moment as stepping into a room bereaved of sound. "I've come to speak with the judge," the reporter said. Samuel's reply was simple. "He's not the kind that speaks anymore." Still, Levi followed the man inside. The house's parlor reeked faintly of damp pages. Dust motes swam through a shaft of gray light that cut diagonally across a shallowed world. There, seated in a wicker chair, head slightly bowed, was Judge Green himself. At first, Levi thought the judge asleep. Then he noticed the eyes open under half-closed lids, fixed on nothing. The skin around them sagged. A tremor darted through the man's cheek like an insect beneath cloth. "Judge Green?" Levi asked softly. The judge's voice came weak, more memory than tone. "Every law, Mr. Pritchard, every law has its debtor. Sir, your town folk." Green's hand lifted slightly, silencing him. "He made no oath to me. I made one to him, and it was the greater sin." "Who do you mean?" "The land," Green muttered. Then louder, almost pleading, "It remembers what we bury." Levi leaned closer, pen scratching paper, when the floorboards groaned. Samuel stood in the doorway, watching. For a second, the reporter thought the man might attack, But instead, Samuel spoke in that calm, unadorned tone. "You take them words down careful, sir. The judge ain't always honest with himself." That evening, as Levi left, drizzle gathered on his shoulders like cold sweat. He turned for one last look at the house. From a second-story window, faint light flickered, the kind made not by candles, but by reflected fire. Then darkness again. Days later, the correspondent tried to return, only to learn from a farmer that the estate was gone quiet. A constable who ventured there found the judge's body seated in his study, pen frozen above an unfinished letter addressed "To whom I answer next." The coroner's report, brief and frightened, lists the cause only as heart cessation during unknown fright. But the true detail that unsettled every man in that room was the black mark on Green's shoulder, identical in size and shape to that found on Murdoch, and before him, Harlow. Samuel, of course, had vanished. Fear raised its ugly head through the surrounding towns. In taverns, planters traced invisible maps on wet counters, counting how the deaths stretched westward from the coast. Ministers thundered against witchcraft. Bitten by curiosity and fear, citizens began digging into old parish ledgers, hunting for any trace of Samuel's origin. A traveling peddler recalled hauling supplies years earlier to a plantation on the Georgia coast, where a half-mad conjure woman had screamed prophecies about an infant who would never wear the yoke long. The child, she said, carried another's shadow. The more people learned, the less they believed the incidents random. A curse needs believers to grow, and this one found them in every fearful whisper. Dr. Alva Kessler, one of the territory's few credentialed physicians, was summoned by the county magistrate to inspect the judge's remains a second time. The doctor's notes still survive among Texas medical archives. The body preserved in uncanny rest, no sign of struggle, no odor of decay after 2 days. The skin cool, almost damp, as though the moisture of life lingered without spirit. Kessler's assistant reported hearing low humming near the corpse while the doctor examined it, a vibration without discernible source. Hours later, the assistant resigned and left town. Dr. Kessler stayed one night longer. He recorded one more line before he, too, disappeared. The mark not burn, but negative. Skin untouched, color drained from within, not placed upon him, but drawn out. His medical bag was found weeks later beside the river, perfectly dry. The surviving powers of the county convened a meeting in the Liberty Courthouse. Behind closed doors sat landowners, ministers, and a ranger captain named Hill. A humid tension filled the room, the odor of cigar smoke and rain-wet wool mixing with fear. "This story's poison in every county from Galveston to Livingston," one man spat. "We lose authority, we lose trade." Ranger Hill drummed his fingers on the table. "Then stop treating it like a story. If there's a man out there killing folk, he bleeds like anyone." Reverend Astor, gray-bearded and staunch, leaned forward. "You misunderstand, Captain. These deaths carry a pattern older than Texas law. The handprint, the silence, the flame it follows deeds, not people. Each man took the same life into his possession. Each broke the same commandment." "You mean to tell me evil walks in skin?" Hill snorted. "I mean," the Reverend whispered, "ownership itself may have a ghost." They argued deep into the storming night. When dawn came, the men signed a resolution: capture or kill the escaped bondsman known as Samuel, to restore lawful order. The county offered a bounty so large that even skeptics took up rifles. Among the bounty hunters was a quiet man named Jeremiah Fitch, a former Confederate scout who prided himself on tracking. He believed superstition and indulgence of weak minds. He found the trail easily bootless prints leading through pine needles near the old Murdoch acreage. For 2 days he followed, sometimes hearing a faint tune like a mournful lullaby echoing through the trees. At dusk of the third day, He came upon Samuel camped beside the ruins of Mount Galilee Chapel. No one knows what passed in words between them, but Fitch's journal, recovered later, bears this fragment written in shaky script. He asked me if I remembered the names of my dead. I said of course. He said he remembered mine too, though we'd not met till now. The next page is smudged, ink run as if by water or sweat. The final line reads, "No smoke, no scream, only silence and light." Fitch's horse returned riderless, saddle wrapped neatly in cloth. His firearm lay on the trail upriver, barrel cooled, never fired. By midsummer, the name Samuel had become untouchable. Newspapers refused to print it. The few articles that slipped through rewrote history, calling him the Phantom of Liberty County. Frontier pulp publishers sold dime pamphlets depicting him as a supernatural avenger, but those closer to the events knew the truth sat uncomfortably between miracle and murder. Private letters tell of men waking from nightmares of fires that left no ash. A preacher in Houston swore he saw Judge Green's likeness appearing in his own mirror for a full minute before vanishing. One woman wrote her cousin, "It is like our whole land breathes shallower now, waiting for something yet unfinished. Reaping continues, but the earth feels frail beneath our feet, as if hollow from too many buried oaths." By late autumn 1853, the county's population began to thin from fear as much as fever. Families packed their wagons and rolled westward. Abandoned homes moldered, windows catching moonlight like blind eyes. Only the enslaved community, those who had once whispered by night, seemed less afraid. They sang lower, slower hymns, weaving the name Samuel into refrains disguised as prayers. To them, the strange deaths were not curse, but reckoning. They spoke of a man who carried generations' pain into battle with the men who'd owned it. When white townsfolk overheard these hymns, they took them as blasphemy. Punishments followed. Yet the music continued, humming in the fields long after whips were put away. Some swore the sound did not come from human throats at all, but from the soil itself. It was during this tense silence that Levi Pritchard returned from Galveston for one final investigation. He found an entirely altered landscape. No guards patrolled the roads. The courthouse stood locked. In the tavern, a single old barkeep whispered to him, "You're too late, boy. The time's turned." "What do you mean?" Levi asked. "Judge gone, preacher dead, rangers missing. You don't chase a storm after it's passed, you just rebuild what's left." Levi pressed for details, but the man shook his head. "Ask the earth. It's the only thing that saw it happen." The reporter stayed 2 nights in Liberty, scrawling pages of fragmented observations. His final entry reads, "He was never a spirit nor man, but a calculus of our crimes. The secret every deed hides comes due one soul at a time. Lord forgive Texas, for the blood remembers." By then, public order demanded explanation. The state governor's office issued a statement attributing the string of deaths to fevers, dissensions, and fanatical rumor. The powerful families closed ranks. Names like Green and Murdoch were struck from polite conversation, estates sold, records expunged. But under such deliberate silence, stories grow like mold in humidity. Children born decades later would still claim their parents forbade walking near certain creeks after dark. Hunters reported seeing a man without chains wandering the woods near the old plantations, unaged. No one could track where the legend ended, because it never quite did. It turned roadside crosses into markers of unfinished judgment and made even skeptics glance twice at their shadows. As the century turned, journalists, priests, and historians revisited the case, each discovering fresh contradictions. Logs of deaths matching the same pattern, counties apart and years distant. Either an impossible coincidence, or the same silent retribution moving endlessly from master to master, name to name. Nowhere in any record did anyone write of capturing Samuel again. Not a death notice, not a grave, not a birth in his line. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Next, the legend reaches its revelation, when the final witnesses uncover not just bodies, but what Samuel left inside those he touched and why the pattern could never die so long as memory itself endured. Decades coat memory with civility, but rot seeps through paint, and nothing in Liberty County ever fully dried. By 1909, when construction crews began clearing land for oil survey lines, the woods behind the collapsed green estate were almost impassable, overrun with vines and rusted remnants of plows that had long ceased to turn. The crews unearthed those floorboards, the rusted box, the teeth with initials, and the parchment that said, "He never belonged to any man." That was how the world learned again of Samuel. But in the half-century between the last death and that unearthing, a handful of testimony and confession had already been waiting. Each unfamiliar, each too afraid to speak until memory itself began to rot. Together their confessions form the map to the revelation. A letter bearing the seal of the Benedictine order in Louisiana, dated 1874, begins with weary resignation. I have confirmed the name of the priest who vanished, Auguste Delarue. A hunter found a scapular on the banks of the Neches River still wet with what looked like resin, not blood. Near it lay a manuscript, his handwriting distinct, though smeared. It tells a story few will tolerate. Inside that manuscript, Delarue recorded his final visit to the green property before his disappearance. He had returned, unsummoned, to face something which pretends to be neither heaven nor hell. The letter details that he found Judge Green alive but deteriorating, his skin pale, his eyes dilated with awe and fear. In the next room, Samuel waited by what remained of a hearth fire. He was singing, wrote the priest, but the tune carried downward, through the earth, rather than into the air. I felt beneath my feet the rumble of something deep answering him. Delarue confronted him, clutching his crucifix. "You must cease these unholy invocations," he said. Samuel turned, voice almost tender. "You say the name in Latin. I say it in the tongue before there was guilt." "What do you seek?" demanded the priest. "Equilibrium," Samuel answered. "Every chain has memory. It waits until it can clasp the right wrist." The priest confessed he nearly fled but stayed. Out of faith, curiosity, or paralysis, he never discerned which. He spoke then of fire not as punishment but as correction, of men who had mistaken ownership for dominion. He said each man who claimed his flesh had taken the debt which should have been shared among all. Later that night, Delarue felt the temperature drop so steeply his candle extinguished itself. He scribbled one final line before ink turned to blur. He touches them once, and they see what they have done, not with eyes, but with soul. The heart stops, for lack of denial. Years later, a different confession emerged. An aged woman in a convent near Nacogdoches declared herself to be Lydia Murdoch, who built altars to fear. The cloistered nuns recorded her mutterings before her death. "My husband tried to chain an angel of retribution," she whispered to the attending sister. "But angels are not kind. They use our hands as mirrors till we break looking." She described that baptism in the creek, the thunder, the tremor in her husband's body as she saw Samuel's expression beneath the water, calm, almost pitying. "He did not drown Ezekiel's faith," she said. "He only reflected it backward." When the sister asked what became of Samuel, Lydia wept soundlessly. "He never left, he just changed skin." The belief that he changed skin became central to the whispering folklore that persisted among the region's black families through Reconstruction. Stories told of a nameless wanderer who worked one day on a farm, vanishing the next, always leaving small gifts behind, fields turning fertile overnight, tools found sharpened, chains discovered shattered where they hung. among the freed communities. No one called him Curse. They called him the Listener of Graves. One tale spoke of an ex-overseer dying in Oklahoma Territory in 1882. Before delirium took him, he insisted that a servant had been visiting him nightly. Silent, eyes gray as ash, only ever saying one line, "Every chain has two ends." When his body was examined, a set of fingerprints burned faintly across his chest. The pattern matched the earlier reports. The print facing inward, as if seared from within, not upon the skin. In 1910, when the box of teeth was brought to Dallas for cataloging, the archivist overseeing the evidence, Angela Despard, a young historian, found something glued beneath the inner lining, a folded scrap of hide. On it, written not in ink but in some ferric substance, were 5 words repeating in sequence. "I am the ode returning." Despard fainted upon reading it. Colleagues attributed it to hysteria. But her later diary, hidden among her estate papers, gives a fuller account. The smallest tooth had been carved not with an initial, but with my own birth letter, A. But I am not of their blood. How could he know my name before I was born, unless debt travels beyond time the way guilt does? She never returned to her post. As researchers pieced these fragments together across the next decades, one theory crystallized, a profane yet coherent logic underlying the so-called curse. Every man who owned Samuel partook in a transaction recorded by blood. When he was sold, each seller and buyer signed into this invisible contract, binding not only their flesh, but their descendants to the spiritual weight of bondage. He, whatever he truly was, served as the medium of that accounting. Neither demon nor saint, but the arithmetic of history correcting its own ledger. He did not kill by weapon or poison. He mirrored. In each victim, he awakened memory so acute it stopped the heart. Their own lives replayed from the other side of the whip. Witnesses described an odor preceding each death: iron, salt, and something like ozone before a storm. That same scent was noted at every site where the handprint appeared. A theologian writing in the 1920s dubbed it the scent of unspoken confession. And yet, the most bewildering revelation surfaced in 1932, when the last living descendant of Judge Green, one Captain Vernon Green, confessed privately to a ghostwriter compiling a Texas history text. The ghostwriter's annotated transcript, never intended for print, reads as follows: VG. There were nights when I dream, and in each, a man waits by the water. He says nothing, just fills his palm with sand and lets it run through like time. I ask his name, he says mine. When the ghostwriter pressed him, Vernon whispered, "We were never punished by him. We are him. The sin wrote its own child." That line never made it into the published history. Vernon's body was found a week later on the porch of his ranch, eyes staring toward the horizon, fist clasped around a single old iron key, its bit shaped unmistakably like a hand. Across theology and folklore, one theme glued these accounts: reflection. Samuel, or the thing called by that name, was not an avenger from without, but a mirror from within. Where he walked, men saw themselves reflected until recognition strangled them. And perhaps the most terrible thought remains: what if his existence was not supernatural at all, but moral, a living manifestation of cause and consequence, an instrument with only one note: truth? If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. Because the deeper the scholars dug into this paradox, the clearer a new horror became. Samuel never vanished. He merely diffused, dissolved into the conscience of the land itself. Fires that year scorched parts of East Texas fields without lightning. Wind carried humming through night air again. Locals said it sounded like a name half-spoken and never finished. By the time the 20th century's historians closed their case files, they realized the tale couldn't end neatly. The parchment, the mark, the pattern continued to ripple through generations of secrecy and guilt. And somewhere, in the fog beyond written proof, lay the suggestion that every injustice ever buried sends up its specter eventually. The revelation, then, isn't that Samuel returned to punish the guilty, it's that he never left because the guilt never did. When the dust settled over Liberty County's memory, Texas did what it had always done: rebuilt, renamed, and repurposed. The past, though, clung to its rafters like smoke that never really left the lungs. In the early 20th century, newspapers handled the legend the way polite families handle scandal, with studied omission. The Dallas Morning Herald ran a short column calling the unearthing of the teeth box a curiosity from a bygone age of superstition. Yet locals knew the laughter rang hollow. School teachers still warned children not to stray past the old green place after dusk. Loggers swore the trees there whispered late in summer heat, voices dry and thin as old paper. By 1912, county officials fenced the ruin, labeling it historic property, in hopes of converting Dread into tourism. But when workers began restoration, their tools rusted overnight. A foreman reported that every photograph taken on site turned out blurred, no matter the exposure. When he tried to pose his men for one shot beside the old study's hearth, the plate came back showing a sixth figure among them, tall and gray-eyed. The foreman left the project, saying only, "That place sets its own wage." Officially, the investigation into the box's contents concluded in bureaucratic dryness. Artifacts of unknown ritual origin dating between 1840–1860. Unofficially, the lab technician who cataloged the teeth resigned soon after, telling colleagues he heard small whispers through glass jars. Meanwhile, among the black communities scattered across eastern Texas, the story evolved differently. Preachers invoked the deadliest slave, not in fear, but in parable. They said the soil itself had remembered its pain and was finally speaking through him. At clandestine gatherings, revivals beneath willow groves, campfire vigils during sharecroppers' strikes, speakers told of a man who had refused to let injustice end in silence. He became a symbol not of vengeance, but of reckoning. "He never stopped being one of us," an elderly deacon told a Works Progress Administration interviewer in the 1930s. "Just turned into what was needed. Maybe he walked out the chain gang line, maybe into the preacher man's robe. You can't chain a conscience. It slips shape." Within those retellings, Samuel became the nameless guardian who watched fields and punished cruelty without mercy. Every drought broken, every abuser struck mysteriously ill, was whispered to be his unseen hand. His myth wove strength where despair once lived. A folklore of resistance hidden inside spirituals and stories told to children, that nothing truly buried stays buried. The white descendants of the Green and Murdoch families navigated the opposite current. The Greens sold their land and fled east to Louisiana, publicly insisting that the legends were Negro superstitions, poisoning legitimate history. Yet their ledgers reveal donations to churches for atonement ceremonies. One letter, dated 1920, from Ernestine Green to a cousin reads, "Every time I pour water, I see it ripple before it touches the glass, as though remembering that creek. We changed our name, but the reflection keeps it." Some tried to reclaim their ancestors' reputations. A local historian published Frontiers of Faith, portraying Judge Green as a kindly patriarch sabotaged by rumor. Libraries now store that volume beside newspaper clippings that quietly contradict it. The effort to sanitize him only amplified curiosity. By mid-century, the case entered academic folklore studies. Scholars debated whether Samuel was an amalgam, one rebellious man mythologized into frontier ghost tale, or a supernatural legend born from racial guilt. Psychology professors presented papers on collective haunting, arguing that trauma re-expresses itself as shared narrative. Yet even they confessed an unease when analyzing the physical evidence. The unaging teeth, the consistent handmark accounts, the vanished witnesses, a folk crime that behaves like physics, one author wrote. Through the 1960s civil rights era, activists resurrected Samuel's image as a bitter emblem of truth come due. Protest signs in parts of Houston read, "We remember the hand." Graffiti painters near Shreveport traced hand shapes on brick in crimson dust. Every generation renamed him Avenger, Conscience, Ghost, Brother. Each definition revealed less about him and more about whomever was speaking. Meanwhile, the old green property decayed utterly. Storms flattened most of it by 1972. Yet hikers still reported inexplicable things, the air turning cold in mid-July, ash falling like snow though no fire burned, footprints appearing in soft earth beside their own before vanishing into grass. A ranger once claimed he found carved into a remaining beam the faint words, "Every bargain holds 2 signatures." It matched the judge's burned letter half a century before. Modern descendants of the enslaved families keep the story alive at annual reunions. They light candles by riverbanks where their ancestors once labored, each flame representing a voice long denied. Some say in those vigils the breeze hums faintly, 3 tones rising, 2 falling, the same rhythm local elders recite as Samuel's breath. Historians attending such ceremonies describe a feeling impossible to record, the blend of grief and vindication, terror and pride. The legend no longer belongs to victims or villains, but to the history between them, the long ledger of what a country owes itself. If there's horror in that, it's the horror of recognition. A century and more has passed, yet the case remains unsolved because it was never truly criminal. It was moral. Courts can absolve men, but the earth keeps evidence longer. Whether supernatural or symbolic, the deadliest slave endures as perfect metaphor for that grim truth. Some debts cannot be paid, only acknowledged. And perhaps that is why the artifact box ended up sealed again, hidden away in the Texas Memorial Museum vaults after a brief exhibit in 1951. The label simply reads, Artifact number 24291. Contents, unverified. Handle with gloves. Do not expose to bright light. Visitors sometimes ask why light might harm old metal and parchment. The curators smile, professional and vague, but every so often, a guard reports hearing what sounds like humming from inside the display vault, low, rhythmic, steady, like breath drawn through the seams of time. A note in the museum's maintenance log from 1998 concludes in careful handwriting. Device checked. No vibration source found. Recommend future inspections at night hours only with 2 staff present. Even in modern glass cases, the story waits, patient as ever. More than a century after the box, the field fires, and the vanished priest, the story still shakes like a fever through Texas soil. Historians have buried it in footnotes. Descendants have disguised it under renovated land deeds and changed names. Yet the hum remains, soft as a held breath behind modern engines, wind turbines, courthouse corridors. It rises when the land goes still as though some tethered conscience keeps inhaling the memory of what men once did here. Perhaps that is the real legacy of Samuel. The reckoning that never releases. The recognition that every system built on ownership builds its own haunting. Whether he was a man of impossible will, an embodiment of justice, or the earth itself answering back, his trail carved a truth too uncomfortable for textbooks. The past does not sleep because we ask it to. It sleeps when its witnesses make peace. So what do you believe? Was the deadliest slave in Texas a phantom forged by guilt, or a man who forced the guilty to see? Was every death divine sentence or mirrored shame? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story.